Hello, welcome to our July roundtable. We are featuring the Battle of the Backdrops here. Beautiful scenes. John Pasalis, you are from my colleague at Velocity Realty, but you are joining us from Greece today.
I am. I'm in downtown Athens today
Beautiful. And
on a
Steve, it
on a
looks,
rainy day. On a rainy day, it rarely rains here.
yes, it still looks pretty bright for a rainy day. And Steve, you're joining us from Vancouver, and
Still
it
in
looks
Vancouver.
still in Vancouver, and it looks beautiful behind you.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty good. John, tell us about the Greek property market.
Oh my gosh, it's hilarious. I was I was in a cab yesterday. Some guy was asking me what I do, and I told him from Toronto. I'm like, the housing market's crazy here, and he says, "You have no idea what crazy is until you try to buy in Greece." He's like, if you try to buy a 500 square foot condo, it costs you 100 to 150,000 euros. I'm like, buddy, you know, we're not in the same league. I mean, I didn't want to burst his bubble, but
Oh no.
I mean, that's obviously a lot. Incomes are a lot lower in Greece. I mean, not to kind of diminish his concerns, because rents are unbelievably low here. I mean, and again, a lot of this is because incomes are significantly lower, but it's an interesting market. I mean, everyone basically lives in these kind of buildings behind me, these like 6-story apartment buildings. Like, there aren't houses
Yeah, where's the
anywhere.
single family detached?
Nothing, but it doesn't, I mean, it exists in the far suburbs. Pretty much everybody lives in these apartment buildings.
All right. So from the markets in Greece to the markets in Canada, let's turn to Steve. Steve, how is the Vancouver market looking in terms of numbers and the feeling on the ground?
Not good. Um, no, I guess it depends who you ask. It's been good for buyers and not so good for sellers. So we've seen, I think, just a continuation of the trend recently over the last several months, which is just things are slowing quite a bit. The rate cut. I think John and I talked about this in the last show. It hasn't really changed any of the numbers. I don't really think it's changed a whole lot in the market. I think we're getting a little bit more activity in terms of people are actually stepping up a little bit now. But offers, like, every buyer wants to come in, test their price, come in a bit lower, be aggressive. So like the gap is just really tough, right? I mean, it's like a seller's expectations are still kind of up here, and the buyers are saying, well, listen, this is the conditions. I want to be way down here. And so trying to sort of like bridge that gap right now, I think is the challenging part, and that's where it's hard to put these transactions together. And I think we're seeing kind of like the flight to quality, which is, if you're in a really good location and you've got a pretty good move-in ready product, that's moving okay. That there's not too many issues there at all. It's just everything else and in between is a tough sell, right? I mean, if you got renovations that need to be done, you're in a suboptimal location. I mean, that's going to be a really tough sell in the current market conditions.
John, Toronto via Athens.
Very Toronto via Athens also not looking very positive. I mean, markets are slowing down quite a bit. I mean, the momentum's. I mean, what's interesting is condos a little bit different from houses again. I mean, condos, another record number of active listings. So last month was the record, and we kind of topped that again in June. Sales are down significantly for condos. New listings are kind of, like I said, or active listings at a record high. So very sluggish market. Um, Sales pretty much for condos are close to a 20-year low. In the low-rise market for houses, sales are at a 20-year low. So, when we talk in the industry, the market being sluggish, that's a lot of times what people talk about. Like, there's very little activity. Very little activity. Active listings for houses are kind of average, but there's just very soft sales volumes. Multiple offers are slowing down. It's kind of it's a quieter market. I'd say it's less predictable what you're going to get on your offer night if you're listing houses. But condos are like, I tweeted out, I think a Toronto Star article that described the condo market as a ghost town in Toronto, and it kind of feels that way. And it's interesting because sales are still happening, obviously, but what's happening is it's kind of like, I feel like it was kind of like COVID, where people would get very few showings and like they'd maybe get an offer. Like, in houses, it's normal to get 30 or 40 or 50 showings, before you sell. Now we're getting far fewer showings for condos. I mean, some are selling. but there's just way less activity in the market right now. So it's quite sluggish. And I'll just add that more recently, like if we, the monthly trends are one thing, but if we can look at more kind of higher frequency, months of inventory for condos continues to surge. I mean, we've hit pretty much 6 months of inventory in Toronto proper. In the GTA, it's close to sort of 5. So it's the city of Toronto has the highest volumes. But low-rise months of inventory appears to kind of be plateauing. So that, and I think that's probably because listings have cooled down a little bit. The balance between buyers and sellers is softening. It's still kind of sluggish, but the momentum isn't sort of building the way it was. We'll see if that trend continues.
All right, John, just to illustrate what you just said, I'm throwing up this headline here from the Toronto Star. Toronto condo sales plummet 28% in June as sales crash across all property types. Despite the Bank of Canada rate cut, prices and sales were down across the board over this time last year. So I guess the question then is, John, we have still a very strong demand crunch. Lots of end users want to get into the market. And, I'm wondering whether this supply surge will help them do that. Or is it instead, like a recent commentator, John Lorick, wrote in the Toronto Star, here, the condo market is tanking in Toronto and no one can find anywhere to live. Here's one major reason why. The condos that are being sold, basically saying the 1+ or 1+ dens, do not meet, these were investor bought condos. They don't meet the needs of end users who are looking for more space for themselves and their families. So wondering what you think about that and what you think about the market dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, right now, the surge in listings isn't providing much relief, and that's because prices are sticking. We're not seeing a ton of downward pressure on condo prices. Investors are holding on. And I might try to unpack this in more detail, but, and I think they're holding on partly because, like, the Toronto area has seen so many of these cycles where listings surge and then months of inventory plummets, demand heats up and it accelerates again and it plummets. Like in the past couple of years, we've done so many of these peaks and valleys. And I think investors, and many of them are investors, like if we look at the data on the number of units that have been sort of listed for sale, definitely the biggest growth has been in smaller units. The one exception is the pure micro condos, like under 500 square feet. Those have low volumes and are pretty flat, but the highest increase in number of new listings is actually the one just above that, 500 to 599. And then it's basically like a downward trend in terms of the growth in new listings. So the bigger you are, the lower the change year over year. And I think this, again, speaks to the fact that we do have a bit of a mismatch. A lot of the inventory is small condos. And again, I think this is one of the reasons kind of I've been, advocating against, and I think I disagree, and I don't even know if Steve disagrees, but like when we have a condo market that's driven like 80% by investors, you're getting micro condos because that's what they want. And you're getting units with crappy layouts because they don't really care as much about the layouts as an end user. And, so many of these economists and housing advocates have been saying, oh, it doesn't matter, just let the, kind of investors dominate the market. And not that I'm against investors, but have a market driven disproportionately by investors. It kind of skews the units significantly. And I think this is partly why we have this imbalance today.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think the on the new construction side, I know, like, in a high-rise condo, right? Like, you're not going to build a 3-bedroom unit because you got to sell that at whatever you got to sell it in the GTA. Let's call it what, $1,400 a foot. Like, so when you start adding up the math, you're going to build, let's say 1,000 square foot unit at $1,400 a foot for a 3-bed. Like the math, just people just say, well, I may as well go into like, semi-detached or whatever. And so I think that's kind of similar in Vancouver. I mean, that's why I think, like, personally, I think we need to be building more like ground-oriented units, right? The things that do cater to the end user, where there is a huge demand for these 3-bedroom family type of units, townhouses, duplexes, if you want to call them infills, whatever. Because I think the math on these high rises is that you have to sell kind of these smaller luxury units.
I'd say that this is definitely the case that you can't sell family-sized units today, but I'd say that this is a trend that's evolved over the past 10, 15 years. Like 10 plus years ago, unit sizes on average were bigger, you know, and they've been declining over the past 15 years. I think partly because construction costs have surged and the appetites of investors are very different from end users. So yeah, definitely, we're not going to be building 1,000 square foot, even 1,200 square foot family-sized units because people can't afford. It's actually cheaper to buy a house, and that's why we're not, selling that type of product.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I think when you look at cost of land and the cost of construction, like what can you build feasibly and sell to the market? I think it is more of these smaller micro type of units, at least in these high-rise condo buildings, right? Where the cost of construction for a concrete building is significantly more than a ground-oriented wood frame, you know, townhouse that doesn't
Hmm.
have an underground parkade, no elevator,
Hmm.
and you can build it in 8 months. Like it's
Hmm.
just a different construction process. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of nuances
Hmm.
that I think are important for people to kind of understand.
So that raises a good point, in the sense that a lot of this idea that investors were going to help build our stock was around the idea that, okay, they'll invest in condos and those condos will turn into rental units, right? So, there was a sort of a gap in the market where the government kind of stepped out of, doing much for rentals. And this is where investors have really taken over in terms of providing those units. But it still hasn't really helped in the sense because, John, you just tweeted temporary residents, a group that includes international students, people on work permits, and asylum claimants, now comprise 6.8% of the population, up from 3.5% 2 years ago. Any thoughts on how that might impact the cost of renting in Canada? So I'm wondering, John, we are seeing a surge in listings for condos. What's happening with rents?
Well, rents have actually been declining. I mean, partly because we have seen a record number of condo completions over the past year. So rents in the GTA are actually still trending down. It's a pretty soft market. But again, I think this is a result of a short-term supply shock, right? Once the market clears there, we'll have to see what happens to rents because again, like there's a very tight relationship between the change in non-permanent residents and the change in rents. There's so many charts that have gone around that basically show this, and it's almost like a perfect correlation, right? Like when non-permanent residents surge, average rents surge, and when they decline, average rents kind of dip. And obviously that makes sense because most non-permanent residents are renting, or virtually all of them. Like they can't even buy a home pretty much in Canada. So there's a direct relationship. So what's going to be interesting is, if the federal government follows through with their plans to reduce non-permanent residents, non-permanent residents will actually be negative over the next 3 years if they do it, right? Which in theory should take pressure off of rent growth. Like we probably shouldn't even see much growth. But then the one kind of flip side to this or caveat is that many of the units that are being listed for sale now are used to be rentals, right? And if they're bought by end users, then you're kind of also simultaneously shrinking the rental stock. So, we'll see how this plays out, but we should see softening growth over the next 3 years. And I think that's actually partly why so many investors are selling because they don't see a lot of the prospects for rent surging, prices plateauing. Like, why the heck am I carrying this thing?
I think it's the same trend in Vancouver. I think like the most obvious trend is just the lack of investors in the marketplace today. I mean, obviously it was prevalent in 2021, 2022 when rates were at basically mortgage rates are at 1.2%. Of course, you had a whole bunch of people just funneling in trying to get in on the gravy train, and those were certainly like your speculators. I think what we're seeing now is just what is the compelling case to be a landlord in, let's say, BC, right? It's like, okay, your mortgage costs have gone from 2 to 5. The government says you can only raise rents at 3%, which is below the cost of maintaining the unit. There's the prospects for future rent growth are dissipating, I think, as the economy kind of weakens. And I think that, again, what's the future price growth with mortgage rates at 5%? So I think all these sort of factors are coming on. I think a lot of investors are looking and saying, well, I definitely don't want to buy a unit. And in fact, I probably want to lighten up my portfolio. Maybe if I have 2 condos, I sell one. And so I think that's kind of the prevailing, theme that we're seeing in the marketplace. And so again, with BC's tenancy laws, I think they're definitely different than Ontario. When you go to sell like an investment property, you can't go to the tenant and say, hey, I'm planning to sell. I'd like to give you notice to vacate so I can sell the unit vacant and paint the walls and stage it and make it look good. No, no, no. You have to keep the tenant in place while you're selling it. And so that just makes it even like in a down market, makes it even harder to sell, harder to get access for showings, doesn't look that is not usually that clean. So like you're already taking a hit because the market's weak, and then you factor in the fact that you can't basically get rid of tenants. We just had the BC government actually come out like yesterday and announce that as of July 18th, you previously had to give 2 months notice to vacate. That was the requirement. So if you say, hey, you're on a month-to-month tenancy and the new buyer has purchased the unit, we're giving you 2 months because the new buyer intends to move in and occupy it. Now its requirement is going to be 4 months.
Oh man.
Which is crazy because if you think about it, you can't even get a mortgage rate hold for 4 months, right? Like you can, like banks, I think TD will give you a 4 month, but you have to give notice in advance of the 4 months. So it's typically on average, we're going to be saying the average time that a tenant's going to receive basically is call it 4.5 months. So like the average person that's buying an investment property now can't even get a rate hold for that long. So like there's just all these factors now that are just making it so anti-landlord that like I can't make a compelling case to be a landlord in BC. And I think that's just what we're seeing in the marketplace. So more condos kind of stacking up. And I do think that's putting downwards pressure on prices.
And
Wow.
Steve, yeah, Steve, you also tweeted, I think yesterday, I think you mentioned that BC is allowing a 3% increase. You tweeted that Ontario is seeing surging mortgage payments, property taxes, and condo fees, and the government has capped rent increases at 2.5%. If you're a landlord in Ontario, your capital is not welcome here.
Yeah, I just think that, again, some people will be okay with that. That's totally fine. I get it. Like, there's probably too many investors in our marketplace. The capital could be deployed in more productive capacities. I get that. I don't love the anti-capitalist rhetoric, but at the same time, I think that's wrong to say, you know, listen, guys, we kind of stoked inflation, we caused it. Yeah, and so that's why, when you can call a plumber now, it's $100 just to get them to come to your place. And so you've created all this inflation, then you cap the revenue growth. Like it's just not it's interesting. And like I said, I just think like regardless of one's political views, I don't think, to me, that's not an environment where I'd want to have my capital. Like I just think there's better places to put it. And so that's, I think, what people are also getting to. I think that's what people are doing now is why would you want to own a portfolio of, let's say, 4 or 5 condos in Toronto or Vancouver? I mean, I think it made a lot more sense when mortgage rates were at 2%. Today, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. And that was kind of my point, John. Like, I think I remember tweeting this like 4 or 5 years ago. I was like, listen, and not that I thought we would get here necessarily, but I was like, take rates from 0, take the BOC overnight rate from 0 and put it at 3 or 4 or 5%. If you can earn 5% in a GIC, I can guarantee you'd have a lot less landlords. And I think we're there and it's happening, right? Like 100%. When you have an alternative to park your money, people will do it. And so I think today you get a 5% guaranteed return with no risk. It's pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you take into account the fact that, like we said, like very few people are expecting many gains on their investment properties. So, at least over the next 2-3 years. But on top of that, many of them, especially about recently, are kind of bleeding cash on these things. So you're thinking, why am I shelling out $1,000 or $1,500 a month to carry this thing if rents are going down and prices aren't going up, right? It's not a compelling case. And like you said, I mean, even though I you know, have a tendency to be like in favor of, you know, tenancy laws. Like the challenge in Ontario, and it sounds like BC is very similar, is like when you skew too far and to sort of tenants' favors, and it's not even that they're tenant favors. Like the problem with Ontario is in so much the relationship, it's that the landlord tenant board's broken, right? It like it, even if you give a tenant a proper notice, they could just decide not to move out, and they could sit there for a year, and it takes them a year to, and I think that's the bigger issue. It's not even that we have to give 2 months notice, right? 2 months notice is very reasonable. 4 months kind of crazy. Like that's almost like you're buying an investment property. I mean, if you're, even if you're an end user, if you're inheriting a tenant, you know, I mean, I don't know, like 4 months seems obviously a bit high,
John,
but
basically what you have to do is you have to push the completion date to basically 4.5 months from today. So you say, I'll buy it. I'm not going to close for 4.5 months. But like I said, if you're closing in 4.5 months, your rate hold doesn't last that long. And it's a long time for like an end user to wait, right? A lot of the time it's like, hey, I'm in a rental situation now. I want to move. I want to get out of here. I want to like move into my new place in 6 weeks. So
yeah,
if you're asking a prospective purchaser to wait
that's
basically
hard.
4.5 months, I mean, that's not very enticing.
You know, the one thing I'll add on the rent control thing, which I thought is interesting, because Peter from our office mentioned it to me. So basically, all of the new condos that are completed in Toronto now are not rent controlled, right? So the landlord can increase it whatever they want. But because the rental market is so terrible, many of the landlords are actually putting clauses in the agreement saying that the landlord will only increase rents by the provincial standard going forward. So it's almost like they're opting into rent control, because you got to think about it. If I'm like a recent graduate, I'm looking at units and rents are declining. I know that if I go into the new condo, there's a risk my rent could go up 10% next year, right?
Yeah.
So to make their units more attractive, a lot of these investors are actually opting into rent control, which I think is actually pretty interesting, to make their units more competitive.
And again, just to touch on that point, in BC, we don't have that with new construction. So like if it's
Oh, everything's rent
built,
controlled.
yeah, if it was built this year or built 13 years ago, it does not matter. You're subject to the same
Interesting.
laws and regulations, which is you are subject to rent control. So I look at that and say, well, that doesn't, as an investor that has places to put their money, do I want to go out there and build new rental housing knowing that my revenues can be capped quite aggressively, like I said, below the rate of maintaining the building, 3%. I mean, yeah. So again, I think I look at it and think, when I talk to some of the big players that are actually building rental units in Vancouver, the conversation is usually catered around, we don't like the regulations, we really dislike them, but we also understand that it is a natural throttle on supply. It does inherently limit new supply. You're just never really going to get this huge flood. Whereas like then we go to like do stuff in Calgary, there's no rent controls. And so what happens is, like, yes, the rents right now they've spiked because the economy is booming and landlords can jack rents, and that sucks. But at the same time, that city always overbuilds, because every time you get a bull market, people just build like crazy, and then eventually the bull market fizzles out and they end up with a huge oversupply and people start reducing rents. So it's very interesting. I don't know. Like I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer here, but it's maybe just a difference of political views or economic views. But
That's fair.
I mean, the interesting thing is how much the political views sort of set the agenda, but the economy kind of steps in and is the final arbiter. So, John, it was the Rob Ford government that actually introduced rolling back rent control on newer buildings. So previously, it did cover
That's right.
everything.
Doug Ford.
Sorry, did I say Rob Ford?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Rob.
Yeah,
say
Doug
names for
Ford,
anything
yes.
anymore. Yes, Doug Ford, sorry, a Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. So, that's interesting, John. And a lot of people miss that. They think all of Ontario has been subject to rent control, but it hasn't really. It's been a tale of two cities.
But to be clear, before 2017, under the Wynne government, the Liberal Wynne government, anything, I can't even remember the date anymore, but basically anything built after like the 90s was not rent controlled. So any condos that were built in the 2000s, like anything over the past 25, 30 years was not rent controlled. And then the Liberals came in 2017 and said, we're going to rent control everything, right? Including brand new builds. And then we had an election and Doug Ford came in and said, okay, you know what, we're going to keep it on everything before today. So anything before November 15, 2018 is rent control, anything after is not. So it's constantly changing, but these are pretty recent changes.
Yeah. So, and sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Well, sorry, I was just going to chime in there. Just, John, this is like for like my, I guess trying to advise clients or just like the big macro picture is like, I think what happens is in governments, whether you're left leaning or right leaning, it's like you get affordability to the crisis levels that we're at today. And these are the type of policies that get enacted, right? Like they're like desperation type of policies where it has to look like they're doing something. And so like, I think what can you sell politically is I just don't see, first of all, I don't see housing affordability getting materially better over the next 3 to 5 years. I think it can improve around the margins slightly. And so because of that, I also feel like there's a very low probability that these policies get rolled back anytime soon.
And kind of returning to the point I was making, even if these political solutions are put in place, depending on how you see things, it's interesting that it's really the economics that's driving it, right? Like if landlords are now opting into the rent control, that's because they want to compete with other rental listings that look better because they're in that bracket. So no matter how you think politically, it is very interesting that as soon as the numbers get in there, you're taking where the market takes you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So I think it's very interesting to hear that, John.
Yeah.
That from your colleague. Very interesting.
And as a tenant, you obviously want to put that in if you're looking to obviously in a newer build to protect yourself. If the landlord, I was talking about situations where a lot of times the landlord and the listing agent are putting it in, but we also want to put it in as, for representing tenants, and Peter does. So, tenants want to be looking at including a clause like that.
I have to be honest. Whenever there's a younger person in my family renting, and I'm like, did you go into a building after 2018? Like, what are you thinking? Right. So, both sides, like we're part of a housing market that's not just, you're not on one side or the other. In different parts of your life, you are on different sides of it, right? And then your concerns will flip to your kids. So I guess it is interesting how these things play out, right?
I mean, I can say this like wholeheartedly. I used to rent at one stage, and I remember I was in like a rental, purpose-built rental building, and because my wife had been there previously, she'd been there for like, I don't know, 7 years or something. So she was like way below market, and you could only raise the rent, like basically it was like, call it 2% a year. And, rents were going up 6-7% a year. So it was just like, there was no incentive to leave. It was great as a tenant. It was awesome. Like, you just like, why would I ever leave? Like the rent was so far below market. You never had to worry about the landlord selling. I think the one thing it actually ends up doing though is like, it's great for someone like myself that was in that unit. It's not so great for the rest of the market that's out there looking for prospective units, because there's no churn. Like, these units don't turn over, they don't churn, because everyone knows like it's in their best interest that if they leave, they're going to be subject to the new market rents. And they're much higher.
But Steve, I mean, that's argument, I think, John, your recent guest, Professor Hyder, I believe, spoke to, that rent control seems to benefit tenants, but it actually only benefits the tenants that are already in the units, not those trying to get in. So there's always been that kind of tension. But on the other hand, Steve, it would allow people like you and your wife to save up way more of a down payment, and that thing has all broken down. So I don't know. I'm not convinced.
I mean, I don't know if I don't know if we're gonna get to like a, I don't think this is like a perfect science. I think it's just there's an ongoing. I think, John, I mean, this debate has been about rent controls and free markets. I mean, this has been going on for hundreds of years. So I don't think we're ever going to get to an agreement.
On that note, I'm going to ramp it up. I'm going to ramp it up to an even more contentious subject.
Go for it.
So we just saw the talk about contentious things that I'll never be solved. We just saw a big headline from the a CIBC report from Benjamin Tal and his colleague, Catherine Judge, reporting that average down payment gifts for first-time homebuyers have soared now into averaging over 100,000 across Canada. That is phenomenal. The quote here, homebuyers relying on a wealth transfer from their parents in order to purchase a home is becoming the norm in Canada, from the report authors. So is this something you're seeing in your practice, Steve?
Oh, I love this question. So was a CIBC article, I read that, I think he was saying like, was it 30%? They said first time buyers, 30% of them were getting money. Was that the percentage?
Let me dig for that. Yes, because it's
it was low.
31% of recent first-time home buyers received a gift, but the amount of this now averaging $115,000 per gift.
I think in BC it was 200 grand.
Yes,
Wow.
you're right. The average down payment sits slightly above 200 grand, a 90% increase since 2019.
Okay, so this is 100% happening. I thought the percentage was really low. I actually
It
think
seems low. I agree. Yeah.
I think in Vancouver, it's like of the first time home buyers that get help from family, I think it's like 95%. Okay, maybe not 95, but I'll say 90%. I'll say I think 9 out of 10 people are getting help. I think if that's not a financial gift, like, hey, here's a check for 100 grand, it's absolutely a cosign on the mortgage, right? So you can qualify for the mortgage. That is happening, I think, in 90 to 100% of cases. And so, yes, we are unfortunately in this wealth-based market. Housing in Vancouver no longer trades off of incomes. It's really how much wealth have you accumulated over your years? How wealthy are your parents? Are they on the housing ladder? Can they cut you a check, or can they co-sign for your mortgage? Because that's how you're going to access the housing ladder. I just think that's the reality. It's weird. It sucks. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
And you make a great observation. If anything, that report, which you're right, it says 36% of first-time buyers getting that help. You're saying that's undercounting, if anything.
I think it's way. And again, I know he's saying like, okay, in BC, so maybe in some of these like smaller, more remote towns where you can buy a detached house for 500 grand, maybe there's not much parental help there. But I can tell you, like, specifically in the Lower Mainland here in Greater Vancouver, where a 1-bedroom condo starts at 500 grand, I find that probably 9 out of 10 people are getting help.
Very good point. John?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I thought that number was low, and I do wonder how much of it is skewed when you look at averages, because it's got to be, I mean, I don't know if it's 90% in Toronto, but it is very high. Definitely like over 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. And I agree, it's definitely in the 6 figures. And Steve's right. I mean, our housing markets aren't driven by income anymore, aren't constrained by income. When you can only borrow 4 to 4.5 times your income, and house prices are 10 times income, I mean, it tells you that it's really capital that's driving the market. And what we're seeing is, again, when I got in this business, whatever, 15, 20 years ago, it was like, gifts were like 25 grand. You know what I mean? That's gone. Like parents who want their kids to stay near them feel handcuffed, like they have to cut these checks. And many of them are effectively just an early inheritance. And this is the way I'm hearing from clients. It's that their parents are just cutting their inheritance checks early, or partial inheritance, I should say. Taking equity out of their home. Maybe the parents are downsizing to pull some equity out to give to their kids to keep them close to them, right? Otherwise, they're worried their kids are just going to leave. So I agree with Steve. It's terrible. It sucks that the market's driven by this, by basically how much money your parents own and have in housing determines your likelihood of buying a home. I think it's terrible, but I agree. I don't think our governments are doing anything to change that anytime soon.
I think the governments have just reinforced that, right? I mean, we had Trudeau
100%.
like 3-4 weeks ago saying, we need to maintain home values because they're important for people's retirements. And so
yeah.
I think this is the route that they've chosen to go, which is like, well, we'd rather just have values be maintained more or less. And if if you want your kids to stay nearby, you're gonna have to cut a check out of that house value that has gone up, 10x, and not because you did anything smart, just what the market did over the last, several decades. It's kind of like, it's like you're playing with house money, right? And so yeah, it's just it's a strange world that we live in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's hard to criticize anyone. It's where you sit in the eco chain. If you can help your kids earlier, why wait till the end, right?
Mhm.
Like, you can't blame people for doing that. You can't blame people for accepting the help. The problem is that part of this, and this, I think we're going to see this in our coming up now, is that it's the nature of taxation, partially of principal residences. Some of these gains are not taxed. In Canada, they're not taxed at all. So any gains you make on a principal residence are tax-free when you sell. That's not necessarily even what people are doing. Some people are just, giving the money in advance, knowing they have that equity in their homes. But the point is that there are, as you guys say, government mandated or government approved ways to increase that gap. So, Steve, you recently tweeted, I think yesterday, about some new talk coming from some groups, one think tank called Generation Squeeze. I think the name makes it obvious what their concerns about housing are. Steve says they're coming for your house next. Liberal funded think tank Generation Squeeze is proposing a home equity tax. And the explanation there is that they are proposing a surtax that would only apply to the top 10% of valuable homes. I think that's homes of 1 million more. And that amount would be taxed. It wouldn't cost 90% of Canadians a penny more. And that group is kind of confusingly calling this a surtax, because as I said, right now there is no tax on principal gains on principal residence. So I think the way that our frequent guest Ben Rabideau states it in his tweet here makes it a little bit clearer. I'm not actually entirely opposed to this. A cap on tax-free gains for principal residences of his suggestions, 250,000 or 550,000 per person is not unreasonable, in my opinion. I will hide under this table now and wait for the angry responses.
He DM'd me today. He's like, remind me to never tweet anything about taxing primary.
Were you one of the angry responses, Steve?
I just said I would be okay with that if you simultaneously at the exact same time lowered income taxes, then okay, we could have that discussion. I just think I'm against raising taxes further without reducing them somewhere else. I think every solution to Canada's problems and housing problems is always a tax. It's like it's foreign buyers tax, it's an empty homes tax, it's raise the capital gains inclusion rate tax. It's like, it's just, guys, like, we got to stop with this. So that was kind of my view is I think that Canadians, like, rite of passage is like primary residence. That's the only, like, one of the only tax shelters where you're not crushed in Canada. And so to remove that, I think is, I don't know. I don't agree with it personally. I just think that we have very few tax shelters in Canada. So if you are going to remove that one, then you got to create room somewhere else.
Which I think is what Ben was saying.
Account. I don't know.
Which I think is what Ben was saying, but he still got trolled online for it anyways, which is
But
funny.
John, that's like an untouchable thing in Canada. What are your thoughts on that? Going at that principal residence?
I think it would be a tough sell. I mean, listen, I think principally, in theory, I don't think it's sacrosanct. Like, I think it's a nuanced discussion. We got to remember, Americans, the land of the free taxes principal residences. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's you're tax exempt on the first 250,000 as an individual or 500,000 as a couple. But I tend to agree with Steve. Like, I think it's like, how about we just stop driving up home prices first? You know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of other things that we can be doing rather than just taxing capital gains. Like, and I agree with you. I think taxing capital gains on houses is in theory fine if you're lowering income taxes, I suppose. But again, I think there's just way more things governments can do. This idea that, you know, and again, I think this is where I disagree with these organizations like Gen Squeeze, like this idea that, okay, well, just like tax the gains, that's going to lower price growth and we're going to distribute that income to renters. I mean, no, you're not. Taxing capital gains does not lower price growth. You know, when your population is growing by 3% per year, real estate's going to go up, rent's going to go up, and house prices are going to go up. It's just like doesn't matter how much tax you layer on that, right? And I don't think it's a good approach to, you know, tax it and redistribute the income. I mean, I think more immediately what they should do is if you want to have generational fairness, give freaking renters a tax break. You know, if home prices in Canada are going up 50 grand a year, well, give them a 50 grand allowance to invest wherever they want tax-free. Almost like go equality that way rather than taxing and trying to redistribute, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that makes more sense to me. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with the most of what you said there. You know, I think that
and
yeah, I don't know. It's just it's so crazy. Every solution is just like raise taxes, and like the government who's basically enabled and created much of the problem
100%.
is gonna fix it. You just have to give them
more money.
And then
yeah.
they'll fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame Gen Squeeze at all. Our housing crisis is disgusting. I mean, and at least raising the discussion around, is this sacrosanct? The interesting point that Ben's numbers are what the US does. You know, the way he said it, he's getting calls of, you know, claiming he's a communist. So this is very interesting. I think raising these questions is very important because it kind of gives us a reality check. Like, you know, what are we not thinking about? So in that sense, I do think it's a valuable discussion. And on the other hand, am I wrong? But what are the chances that Poilievre and Trudeau, I don't even think he's gonna be there, would go near this with like a
this
1,000-foot pole?
But this continues to kind of come up, right? And so like this Gen Squeeze guy, just like I know Paul, I've met him, and like he just won't go away. Like it's like his reports keep coming up. You know, he was funded by CMHC, which is de facto by the government several years ago, and it got all this mainstream publicity, and the Liberals kind of like said, "Oh no, shut it down. We're not talking about that." And so, well, you're paying for the research to create these ideas and reports, and then, you know, now we got another one that's surfacing again from Gen Squeeze, and it's like, so to me, it's kind of like, well, why do we keep funding this individual and this organization if we're not seriously at least having a discussion behind the curtains about?
Well, I think them raising the question is probably every so often raising the discussion, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree. I don't think it's terrible to fund them. I don't think it's terrible to get their ideas. I mean, it doesn't mean people are going to action them. I think that's just the whole point of a lot of these research papers. You know what I mean?
That's fair. That's fair.
Also, it's a move. It's a move to fund a study as part of the response.
Can I chime in there quickly? So the tax, again, this is such a proposal, and I agree with you guys. I don't think it's going to see the light of day. I just think it's interesting that, like, I like to pick holes in things, and so, you know, they say, oh, don't worry, it only touches the top, whatever, 10% of Canadian households. So in Greater Vancouver, this is like not just city of Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, if I look at the median home price, so they've proposed this Gen Squeeze has proposed a 1% annual tax on homes that are valued above $1 million. You don't have to pay the tax right away. You can basically just defer it. So when you eventually sell in 10 years, you'll have this like big tax bill that you have to pay that's accumulated. But he says on homes priced above $1 million, we'll tax them. The median home price in Greater Vancouver today is $980,000. The average home price is 1.35. The MLS home price index is 1.2. So basically, essentially, we're taxing like the average house would get
basically
hit by this.
Yeah, and Toronto's the same. I think our median's 990, which means basically 50% of the homes would get taxed. So Yeah, I don't know.
Well,
So
It's not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen anyways. There's
I'm
no
going to
way.
leave the last word to Steve there. We've given you all, as we head into the weekend, a lot of juicy discussions that could be argued
people are gonna
over
be really angry. I can't wait
at
for
the barbecues. No, it's good. It's good. Toronto's sunny. Take this mood into your barbecues, Vancouver. And I think we'll end there, John. There's such a charming dusk now settling
I just
on
noticed
you
it.
in Athens. We have to release you into that good night.
What are you drinking tonight?
It's a good idea. We'll see. Some Greek I don't know, some Greek beverages for sure.
Yeah, and maybe send me some listings from
All right.
Athens. Also, okay. Well, thank you guys as always for your the quality
Hold on, I have
discussion.
one more question.
Yeah.
Yes.
John, where are you staying? Are you staying in an Airbnb?
No, I'm not.
Okay, you're off the hook then.
I'm off the
Didn't
hook.
they get militant, the people of Athens,
Oh my
against
God.
Airbnbs?
There's
You
a
can't admit that
lot of-
out loud.
Yeah, there's a lot of anti-Airbnb here now. Yeah.
Like
so.
roaming mobs might go
Seems
I
to
after.
be a
know.
theme.
Yeah, they hate it. A lot of people are buying them, and yeah, exactly. That's one of the reasons they say property prices are surging here is because everyone's just buying up these properties because they're so cheap and converting them to Airbnbs. And they have to do Airbnbs because rents are so cheap. It doesn't make sense to buy a apartment here and rent it to a local tenant because rents are virtually nothing. It's like, it's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. But we laugh at the numbers, but if you're a local person making local salary, it
You can't
is
afford it.
causing a
Sounds like
tremendous change
Toronto and
here.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
That's it.
It changes your
Very
neighborhood.
true. Very true.
So yeah. All right. Well, we'll
Okay.
keep the discussion going. You can reach us on Twitter, Twitter at Steve Soretsky. John is at John Pasalis. The show is at Move Smartly. Thank you all. Keep your comments coming and join us next month. See which backdrops change.